book of Daniel was written some 2,600 years ago, and yet it speaks to us in our modern generation in ways that are amazing, inspiring hope and confidence in a God who is in control of all things. Today we are going to look at a brief overview of the book of Daniel. We want to discover that God is in control, that God cares about his people. Daniel is one of the most fascinating books in the Bible. It is full of colorful, dramatic, enigmatic expressions, many symbols that titillate the imagination. The book of Daniel leaves us wondering what it is talking about. And this is especially true of the last 6 chapters of the book. As we consider this book today, I want us to think of the 4 Hebrew young men who come out in the first 6 chapters of the book. We think of them: Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What wonderful young people of integrity, and how they lived their day in times of uncertainty, and yet they lived with integrity. Their lives speak to us as we live in our own times of uncertainty, and we seek for God's confirmation that he cares about us. Longman Tremper has said that the book of Daniel, especially the first 6 chapters, the stories that are covered in those chapters present something of an enigma. They are simple, deceptively simple. They are short and to the point, and they are complete. And yet they hide behind them a profound message for God's people today. The last 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are steeped in deep symbolism. We read and we read again, and we don't always understand what they mean. And even Daniel himself had problems understanding what those symbolisms meant. And a divine angel, a heavenly angel, had to come and assist him to try to understand. And even when the angel came to try to help him to understand, he still remained without understanding on a number of portions. Come with me to the book of Daniel as we look at an overview of this delightful, wonderful book of the Old Testament. The book of Daniel belongs to a type of literature that is called apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature is a special kind of literature that was written in deep symbolism. It is literature that was written in times of crisis, in times of difficulty. Apocalyptic literature, such as the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, have been referred to as a tract for hard times, when God's people are embroiled in difficulties and challenges and uncertainties that they cannot fully understand. The book of Daniel, the book of Revelation are intended to communicate hope and confidence in a God who is able to deliver them. So as we look at the book of Daniel, you will remember that the book of Daniel is written in a setting of crisis. The city of Jerusalem, the beloved capital city of the people of Judah, had been devastated by Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem in ruins, the temple pulled down and destroyed, the temple vessels taken to a pagan temple in Babylon, the people of Judah taken as exiles. What a time to be alive when so much was so uncertain. And those uncertainties were very, very real. We tend to think of this book, we read its words, but we fail to imagine the heartbeat of pain and uncertainty that those who lived through those times must have gone through. Yet they were very real crises, and the book of Daniel is written at such a time when God's people who are now in exile in Babylon need to hear a word from the Lord. Is God still present? Is he close? Does he care about their current situation? The people of Judah in Babylon needed to know that there was a God who cared. So in this crisis setting of the book of Daniel, we find Daniel writing this book. He is not writing from a comfortable place. He is himself part of the crisis, and his three friends are part of the crisis. So it's a book that is written in pain. It is written in discomfort. We experience our pain and our discomfort today. Daniel would understand us, because Daniel lived through just such times as we do. The book of Daniel is divided into 12 chapters, as you'll remember. And those 12 chapters are further divided into 6 chapters, chapters 1 to 6, and another 6 chapters, chapters 7 to 12. Those two sections of the book are quite different from each other. Chapters 1 to 6 contain small, complete stories or dramas. Chapters 7 to 12 contain long prophetic passages and timelines. Chapters 1 to 6 speak to us in plain, simple language. Chapters 7 to 12 bring rich and deep symbolism that leaves us wondering what God is trying to say to us. Chapters 1 to 6 have stories that are complete in themselves in each chapter. Chapters 7 to 12, there are prophecies that run one into the next without a very clear sense of completion. So these are different sections of the book. In fact, they are so different that some people have thought that the two sections may have been written by two different authors at different times. But as you closely look at this book of Daniel, you realize that it is indeed written by one author. It has one continuous theme, and it helps us to understand that God is in control. I want us to look at the first section, those 6 chapters of Daniel, chapters 1 to 6. I want us to look at how they speak to us in special ways. Those 6 chapters involve 6 dramas. They involve 6 life crises. Let's look at them just very briefly. Chapter 1 is a crisis of lifestyle. Daniel and his friends have just freshly come from Jerusalem, and there they are in Babylon, and they've been chosen to join a group of young people who are going to be going for special training to serve in the king's court. That might look like a wonderful advantage until mealtime comes. And as mealtime comes, suddenly they are faced with foods that they know are unclean, foods that the God of heaven has said must not be eaten. There now around the table is a crisis. That's a crisis of a lifestyle. What are they going to do? Are they going to compromise and say, well, we are not home, these are not our own choices, we will eat what we are given, God understands? Or are they going to say, no, the God whom we worship has told us that we eat differently? They choose the latter. And so we see Daniel and his friends right there at the table, faced with this crisis, a crisis of a lifestyle, such things as what you eat, what you wear, the kinds of things that involve your day-to-day life. And Daniel purposed in his heart, along with his friends, that they would not defile themselves with the king's meat or with the drink, the wine that was before them. So they asked for special permission. They are dealing with a crisis, but they are dealing with it from God's perspective. They want to remain obedient. So in this first chapter, we see one crisis, one drama, the crisis of lifestyle, the drama around the table, the meal table. We face those crises today as we make choices. We as God's children, choices about what to eat, what to wear. Are we going to simply go with what is around us? Or do we have a God in heaven who prescribes for us what we should do? Chapter 2. In chapter 2, everybody goes to bed. Everything is normal. The king has a dream that night. And when he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't remember his dream. And that precipitates a crisis. and that is a crisis of knowledge. The king wants to know, what did I dream about, and what does it mean? And nobody else knows. The wise men are called up and they don't know. And soon Daniel and his friends are involved in this crisis. And they are being now marshaled to be executed because they cannot tell the king what he dreamt. Crisis. The book is written in crisis. But right there, Daniel and his friends again have a resolution that comes from God's perspective. They ask for extra time. They go for prayer to speak to their God about this crisis. And God delivers them. Daniel is able to come and tell the king what he had dreamt about. And we think that life has come back to normal until chapter 3 comes around. And when chapter 3 comes around, this king Nebuchadnezzar wants to impress his subjects with his greatness. So he decides that he is going to have this great image of gold, because gold represented Babylon. So he has this great image of gold in the plain of Dura, and he wants everybody, all the significant people in his kingdom, to bow before it, to show their allegiance to him. Daniel may not have been present at this particular time. His name is not mentioned in chapter 3. But his friends are there, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. And they must have been junior officers in government at this time. They had not yet risen up in ranks. So they may have been up at the back of the crowd, sitting in those seats that are unassigned or undesignated, while the great important people were sitting in the significant seats closer to the king. The crisis develops when the king orders that everybody bows down, and they choose not to bow down. And what shows us that they were far from the king on the edge of the crowd is that someone had to say, over here at the back, there are 3 fellows who did not bow down. So we find a crisis developing. What had started as a fresh, ordinary day is turning into a crisis as they are called before the angry king, and they must answer for their disobedience. And so this crisis of worship, who are you going to worship? Can you worship the images of the kings, or do you worship only the God of heaven? There's a crisis of worship in chapter 3, and the drama is played right there on the plain of Dura. The young men now come to the center of the circle, as we know the story, and the drama plays out. And as it plays out, we find that God comes through. Can God be trusted in times of crisis? Daniel chapter 3 tells us, yes, he can. You can trust in him. You can count on him in times of crisis. Chapter 4 comes around. And when chapter 4 comes around, this is the king having another dream. This frequently dreaming king. This time he remembers his dream, but he wants to know the interpretation. And again he calls his wise men, and they do not know the meaning. But Daniel finds himself again in the center of this crisis, and he has to tell this king in chapter 4 that you are a proud king. There is a God in heaven who has the final word. This is a crisis of sovereignty. You are not sovereign, your king, you or king. It is the God of heaven who is sovereign. And so we find in the unfolding of the story, eventually Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind and he goes out into the woods. But Daniel has been brought to the fore again in the center of this crisis. Chapter 5 comes around, and it is another king, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. And he has this feast. He has been on the throne for about 10 years now, and he is celebrating his greatness. And so he asks for the vessels of the temple of God to be brought from the gods of Shinar, so that he may serve his wine among his lords in those vessels. As kind of a defiance of the God of the Hebrews, the God to whom these vessels belonged. So there is another crisis. It's a crisis in the banquet hall. And we find Daniel, who probably had not come to this banquet, finds himself drawn into this crisis. God's children are always drawn into the crisis, and they always have a special role to play in the crisis that play out. Eventually, it is Daniel who is telling the king, "You, O king, your grandfather, must have told you about the God of heaven, and yet you have decided to do what you know is not right." And he tries to let the king realize that he's in the wrong. And he reads for him the meaning of that writing on the wall, a writing that had doom for the king. So the crisis comes to an end. Daniel and the remnant are safe, and Babylon comes to an end that night. Then comes chapter 6, the last of the first 6 chapters. And in that chapter, Daniel is doing his work faithfully. He goes to his office, he does his duties, he does faithfully what he knows to do. But then there's jealousy among his colleagues, Babylonians. They don't like him because of his faithfulness, and they start plotting against him. And we know the story, and we know how Daniel decides he is going to continue to pray to the God of heaven, even though there is a decree that has been made by Darius that only the king may be prayed to at this time. And so we find another crisis, the final one of the 6 crises of the first 6 chapters of Daniel. But we find in that crisis Daniel thrown into the lion's den, even though he is innocent. Those who are guilty seem to go scot-free. They are at homes with their parents, with their children, their families. But Daniel is in the lion's den for that night. But God is with him. God comes through. Can God be trusted in crisis? Daniel 6 tells us God can be trusted in crisis. So the first 6 chapters of Daniel are these 6 stories. We like to use these 6 stories as Bible stories, as bedtime stories for our children. When we are going to send them to bed and we want to tell them a story from the Bible, we tell them about the 3 Hebrew young men. We tell them about Daniel at the king's table. We tell about Daniel in the lion's den. These are delightful stories. We like them because we understand them. We like them because they are short and to the point. We like them because we know their conclusion. But we don't tell Bible stories or bedtime stories from chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. We don't do that because we don't fully understand them ourselves. They are not so simple. So, if we look at these first 6 chapters as 6 mini dramas, they are the kinds of dramas that you can watch to their conclusion. And each one of them has one key point to say. Each one of them says, in crisis, God can be trusted. So we find it in chapter 1. Yes, about lifestyle, God can be trusted. We find it in chapter 2. About wisdom and knowledge, God can be trusted. We find it in chapter 3. About the crisis of worship, God can be trusted. We find in chapter 4 about the crisis of sovereignty, God can be trusted. Chapter 5, when the king wants to be stubborn and to do his own thing, God can be trusted. Chapter 6, crisis of integrity, God can be trusted. So over and over, 6 different times, God plays over this idea of his being one who is in control and one who can be trusted. The first 6 chapters have 2 main functions. One function is to introduce us to the author of the book of Daniel. We get to know who he is because of the way he is involved in each of the stories of these chapters. So we get to know Daniel. When we hear Daniel, we know the fellow at the king's table. We know the fellow standing before the king and telling him his dream. We know him in the different settings, interpreting the writing on the wall or being in the lion's den and being delivered that night. We know Daniel. So it serves to introduce the author of the book of Daniel so that we are better acquainted with him and his integrity. But there's a second function of those first 6 chapters. That function is to help us to be prepared for the 6 complex chapters from chapter 7 to 12. Those are prophecies that are still unfolding. They involve crises for the people of God, but they are not mini crises like around the table or in front of the king or in a lion's den or in a fiery furnace. They are not local dramas. These are now cosmic dramas, cosmic crises. So the first 6 chapters help us to be ready for the last cosmic chapters, the ones that have crises that embrace the whole world. That's what those first 6 chapters do. They prepare us for those chapters. How do they prepare us for them? They prepare us by helping us to understand 6 different times that in crisis you can trust God. So when we enter into the last 6 chapters, chapters 7 to 12, we will then know in our crisis, when the little horn is pursuing the people of God and trying to get rid of them, we know that God can be trusted. How do we know? Of course, there's chapter 1, there's chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We know God can be trusted. So when we are in our chapter 7 and the little horn is making war against the saints in our own generation, we know God can be trusted. We know that if there is a fiery furnace that comes for our trial in our day, that God can be trusted. We saw it in chapter 3. We know that we can be people of integrity in places of work, even though that may threaten our security and our relationships with others who don't want to be of integrity. We know that it pays to be a person of integrity. How do we know? God can be trusted. We saw it in chapter 6. So those first 6 chapters prepare us for the last 6 chapters. So the book of Daniel helps us to try to understand that God is indeed in control. I want to share with you a quotation from the book Prophets and Kings, a book written by Ellen G. White, and it says, describing how the various kingdoms in the book of Daniel seem to follow one after the other, and we may think that it's simply human wisdom. It says, in the annals of human history, the growth of nations, the rise and fall of empires appear as if dependent on the will and prowess of men. But in the word of God, the curtain is drawn aside, and we behold above, behind, and through all the play and counterplay of human interest and power and passions, the agencies of the all-merciful one, silently, patiently working out the counsels of his own will. So God is involved in the affairs of the world. We are not left to ourselves. There's a God who is in control. God will indeed write the final line of human history. So as we look at the book of Daniel, we realize that the book of Daniel helps us to understand who we are. We are God's remnant people. And as God's remnant people, we play a certain place, a special role. We as Seventh-day Adventists, from our very beginning, have a self-understanding that we are an apocalyptic movement, that we are God's remnant. Sometimes when we hear the word remnant, we think it's a little bit of prudish. We think that it's a bit proud to call yourself remnant. But that's not actually so. Because being the remnant is actually by God's choice. It is a sign of God's grace. He chooses the remnant. We don't make ourselves the remnant. So if we think of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego as the remnant in Babylon, we realize that they did not choose themselves as the remnant. Rather, God placed them in a position where they became the remnant. Daniel did not say to the people, hey, I'm here. I'm going to demonstrate who I am here at the table. You will know I'm the remnant. No, God thrust him into that position, and he remained faithful. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not say, hey, there is an image here. All of you who are gathered here, I want you to know there's a remnant here. No, no, no. God thrust them into that position through the situation, the crisis that developed around them. I want you to notice something that happens in all of these 6 short stories of chapters 1 to 6. I want you to notice that the stories begin with the remnant somewhere in the background. But as the stories, as the crisis unfolds, the remnant are brought to the front or to the fore. So in chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are sitting among many others at the table. You couldn't have isolated them. But the situation, the kind of food presented to them, makes them end up being the focal point. And the book of Daniel chapter 1 is not talking about all the others who are being trained by the king. It now focuses on the remnant. In chapter 2, there were many wise men of Babylon who were called by the king. But in the end, it's Daniel who is standing in front of the king, again, chosen from somewhere in the background to come to the center, to the focal point. We see the same in chapter 3. The 3 Hebrew young men, they are somewhere in the crowd, but by the end of the story, they are at the center, they are right in front of the king. So God has a way of taking the remnant away from places of obscurity to bring them to places of prominence. Because the remnant have a mission, a God-given mission, to declare who God is to the world. And the book of Daniel tells us that the remnant are not going to be functioning in a background corner, that God is going to bring them to the focal point of history. They are going to be people who will have to be reckoned with. The remnant are humble people. They don't project themselves. They don't say of themselves, here I am, look at me, better than you. They are humble people. They trust in God. They know with certainty that God can be trusted. We are the remnant living in the last days. Are we going to be a Daniel, a Shadrach, a Meshach, and a Abednego? Are we going to stand in the crises that surround us and stand in that place with faithfulness? Can God count on us? We are asking the question, can God be trusted? And the book of Daniel tells us, yes, he can be trusted. But flip the question around. Can God trust us? Can God count on us to make a difference for him in a world that's gone astray? The book of Daniel tells us that the remnant are faithful to God, and God is faithful to them. We are a people of hope. We are surrounded by crises of our day, financial crisis, economic crisis, now the coronavirus crisis that is upon us, and we don't seem to know where to turn. But we don't act in panic. Daniel and his friends did not go into panic mode. They went into faith mode. They trusted in God, and God was faithful. God could be trusted. So we, faced with financial uncertainty, economic uncertainty, faced with coronavirus uncertainty, we may know with a certainty that God is in control. God can be trusted. We can put our faith in him. May God bless you as you read the book of Daniel for yourself and your family.